Hello. Today on the podcast, I'm so excited to have Audrey Tang. Many of you will already be familiar with her work. She's the current Cyber Ambassador of Taiwan, a principal author of the excellent book Plurality, and a frequent collaborator on technology projects across international lines. She's inspired me for many years to think bigger and more positively and more expansively about technology. And she's also like no other politician I think you will ever encounter. For instance, Audrey is a middle school dropout and an autodidact. And when we met in Taipei, she told me she's been reading less wrong since when Eliezer was still writing the sequences. So, welcome, Audrey.
Hello, good local time, everyone. Very happy to be on the show.
So, Audrey, you began your career not as a politician, but as a programmer. You contributed to a variety of free software projects in Perl and Haskell. You've started your own startups. You worked on Siri at Apple. Only I think it was when you got involved with Taiwan's pro democracy sunflower movement in 2014 that you entered activism and then government. So, which came first, your interest in politics or your interest in technology?
Well, in a sense, I was into activism since I was a very young child. When I was born, Taiwan was still under the martial law, and it was not legal to, for example, form new parties. And my parents, as journalists, participated in the earliest community building, grassroots. My mom co-founded Homemakers Union, which shaped to be still Taiwan's largest consumer co-op, and my dad headed the first community college, and so on. So in a sense, the activism is really in the roots of our family. And when I was just dropping out of school, when I was 14, immediately started this dot-com's entrepreneurship track, but also concurrently participated in the activism in Taiwan around experimental education or the right of children to essentially choose their own curriculum. And so I wouldn't say that in Taiwan there's two different generations of people, one older upholding political institutions and the other more technology oriented. In Taiwan, it's literally the same people. The same generation that brought personal computers also brought the lifting of the martial law, and the same generation of people that brought the World Wide Web, the browsers, and so on are also the same generation that voted in the president for the first time in '96.
That's really interesting to see the pro democracy and the pro internet generation come up together. Could you say more about how that was intertwined when you were growing up?
Yeah, definitely. Uh, so in the very beginning, when I studied like the dial-up BBS and later on the internet, a lot of organizers already use these technologies to communicate. And when my dad participated as a spokesperson to one of the candidates during the first presidential race in '96, already we're using the browser and what later would be called Web 2.0 ways of getting inputs from citizens and so on. So to us, democracy is always like a social technology. It is not some old institution that cannot be changed, that is read only, but rather it is something that we own and we write together. It's almost like semiconductor technology that you can upgrade every year to different layers, different designs. We introduce the ideas of, for example, participatory budgeting, of e-petitions, of sandboxes, and so on quite early on. Of course, they didn't originate in Taiwan. They originate in Brazil or in Spain and other places, but we brought them almost as quickly as they appeared elsewhere in the world.
I'd read an article where someone described this phenomenon of the internet and democracy coming hand in hand as the Palo Alto consensus in the United States during the Bill Clinton era or associated with the Atari Democrats. And then people talk about the Palo Alto consensus collapsing. They say that, oh, because we had Facebook and the whole world was connected, but actually this ended up being really bad because it polarized people more, or they just got angry at each other and read too much misinformation. But you still seem like an optimist about some version, at least, of the Palo Alto consensus. I'm curious what you make of that.
I think it's not the same time when people are connected together and polarization drove us apart. There's a very specific point in time in 2015 when the social network companies switched from what used to be a common experience into what's a individualized experience optimized only for the addiction, for the time you spend on touch screens. And so that's when we have the autoplay, when Instagram switched to an algorithmic feed, when the old following feed made itself like unimportant, and of course later on TikTok and everything, right? So I do think that there existed a time, and now Blue Sky and the Fediverse is trying to go back to that time where the connecting everybody together does not automatically lead to polarization. And because in Taiwan, our domestic equivalent of Reddit, for example, is PPT, and it's maintained by the National Taiwan University's Student Club. So there's no shareholders, there's no advertisers pressure. So there was never a algorithmic feed push that convinced those platform operators. Indeed, because it's open source, it's probably very difficult to force something like that to the users. And so, because we enjoy a more robust digital civic architecture, we've never seen the full-fledged polarization that was brought in other corners of the world because we have a kind of counterbalancing force through the civic infrastructure.
Why do you think there hasn't been a company looking at PTT and thinking, oh, that's an opportunity to build something that's like that, but way more addictive and people like more? Why do you think that's persisted and been so resilient?
I think, first of all, because people understand that they have a choice to migrate, to move. And so you can only get away with highly addictive extractive algorithms if you know that your users are trapped. Year and a half ago, there was a study that shows when people in the US and undergrad using TikTok, you have to pay them almost $60 a month for them to migrate away because they perceive they lose that much utility of FOMO. But if there's a magic button they can press to migrate everybody away, they're willing to pay you almost 30 US dollars a month to do that. And so obviously everybody's losing utility, but it was just the first one moving off, lose even more, right? So that only happens when you don't have the freedom to migrate between platforms. So I do think that because of our commitment in Taiwan to build such an infrastructure as something that is more portable, that people own, more like how you own your telecom numbers. Even if you switch telecom providers, you can still keep the number. That keeps the pressure, the competition toward the top. That is to say, the quality delivered, rather than how much you can capture users into a addictive regime.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I assume that this mission is related to the work that you are currently doing with Project Liberty on the people's bid to acquire TikTok. I'm
Mhm.
curious if you could say more about that.
Sure. It's not just Frank McCourt, but also O'Leary, and now one of the co-founders of Reddit has joined the People's Bid. So basically, the idea is to make sure that when TikTok runs on a US-based team as required by the law, anyone can have a choice of how to present those front-end experiences, meaning that if you post on TikTok, you will be able to view it on Blue Sky, on Truth Social, any other places through Federation. People already using Blue Sky or Mastodon know exactly what I'm talking about. It is like if you publish your podcast on one index, you do not actually have control over what kind of players, what kind of experience people have consuming your podcast. So the platform becomes much more like a recommendation engine that is built by the people with the people instead of a single algorithm that is controlling the people in a top-down or very opaque way.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And we've talked in the past about how you imagine there are pro-social ways that you can build algorithms or technologies. And I'm curious to hear some of these tools. Like, how do you
Mhm.
imagine algorithms can be introduced in ways that strengthen civic infrastructure rather than weakening it?
Well, for people who have experienced community notes, you know that this is basically a way for people to add useful context to any posts. It used to be on Twitter and now X.com, but also it's spreading to YouTube and soon the Meta platforms as well. And the idea is that each person can upvote or downvote any of the notes other people provided, but only the upwing, that is to say, the content billed as useful by both the left wing and the right wing will flow to the top because it is bridging. And this bridging algorithm came from a long line of applied research that was first used in Taiwan in 2015. So when we deliberated the Uber case in Taiwan, instead of asking people choose between extractive gig economy and sharing economy, things like that, more abstract, we actually just ask people how they feel. So the Uber driver, taxi drivers, passengers, they all log on to a deliberative democracy platform, vTaiwan, which is open source, and then people can see each other's reflections, thoughts, feelings about the Uber situation. So, for example, you might write, I feel that insurance is important, or search pricing is fine, but undercutting existing meters is not. And then other people will upvote or downvote to show whether they resonate with your feelings. And the polis algorithm clusters people into the k-means clustering that each cluster represents a kind of faction, a tribe. So it shows what drives people apart. But they also show the bridging statement that brings people closer, and people kind of compete on those because there's no reply button, no room for trolls to grow. It is, again, a race to the top, not to the bottom of brainstem of constant trolling and attention seeking. And people are quite surprised after 3 weeks of conversation to discover most people do agree on most of the actual measures with most of their neighbors most of the time. And so we took those bridging items and made them law. And that's how we resolved the Uber situation in Taiwan. So I think the lesson, the main takeaway here is that polarization is not a function of specific people. It is a function of the space. If you make the algorithm prioritize the dunking, the viral polarized broadcasts, people are going to perceive each other as more polarized as they actually are. But if you build systems that prioritize this kind of bridge making systems, then people are going to perceive that there's what we call an uncommon ground, a rare common ground that can bring people together despite their initial differences.
I definitely buy that a lot of the time there are fundamental agreements that are not being brought to the surface. And technologies like Polis, I really like this case study, are really good at finding those and showing this is what we can make traction on. But I feel like the other thing about social media, though, is that to some extent, people do like dunking. When I worked on social media algorithms, if you run A/B tests, oftentimes people like the polarizing content more. They will look up more content. They will click like more. I saw in the data that a lot of times the top notes on Substack's feed were these very like partisan, screw Donald Trump or like screw the Democrats type notes. And I found this a little bit depressing at the time because I would love to believe that people wanted more nuance, but oftentimes they chose, even independent of algorithms that push them in that direction, more polarizing content. So I guess I'm wondering, is it always the algorithm's fault, or are people sometimes just choosing to antagonize other people?
Well, that depends on how you do the measurement. If you measure this kind of instinctive responses, then of course there exists all sorts of dark patterns that can elicit addiction. On the other hand, if you measure, for example, the satisfaction, subjective, or like how much time you want to spend as opposed to you actually spend on it, or as I mentioned, uh, how many dollars do I have to pay you to keep you on the platform, and how much you are willing to pay me if you're migrating everybody to a different platform. If you measure it this way, then you tend to find that people have meta preferences. It's like people prefer to smoke, but prefer to not to prefer to smoke. Right? So then upon further reflection, people can see that actually they would prefer more common experiences with their neighbors. But if you just measure the instinctive response, then of course you're getting system one, the fast thinking signals.
That's a really good point because I often feel like part of the challenge of building technology products in a pro-human, pro-social way is that people's short-term and their long-term wants are often very different. I mean, it doesn't even have to be like digital technology. I think of like junk food, right? Like if you put like a stalk of celery and a bag of chips in front of me right now, I will probably choose the bag of chips. But if I'm thinking in a more long-term way, I don't want to choose that every single individual time, right?
Mhm.
And so it's interesting because like the technology ecosystem as it currently exists in Silicon Valley prioritizes meeting people's short-term wants at like faster and faster speeds so that you can get your food or your potato chips like even faster and you can see even more pieces of polarizing content in a shorter period of time. And so I wonder whether or not we need like a more fundamental rewiring of the ecosystem in order to get platforms that are optimizing for different metrics, as you say.
I think one part of it is just how isolated people are in the first place. There's a famous experiment a few decades ago called the rat park, that rats self-administer drugs and get addicted to it. But interestingly, they only do so because the lab environment is a confined environment. If they're put into a park with social activities, like in Taiwan, the humans have food together, enjoy each other's company, do civic activities together, even taking out trash together, and so on. And once people are in that mood, they're actually much less likely to be addicted to those short-term hits. And so the configuration is not just in the tech ecosystem, that is, of course, one part of it, but also to bring more communal and group-based activities so that people can actually see that, oh, this piece of information, it is not just me seeing it or not a precision targeting an advertiser want me to see it, but rather it is a enjoyable experience that I know the other communities that I'm in are also enjoying, and that brings people together. So this is a fundamental insight in the recent paper that I co-wrote, Pro Social Media. It's basically saying shared experiences are actually addictive in a different way and perhaps in a more healthy way.
Hmm. I see. Do you use that app Partyful? Like
Partyful.
yeah, the events app.
No, no, not yet. I checked out your links to Esmeralda, the city building project,
Oh.
and Socrates, the like discovery of common interests and so on. So these are the kind of pro-social
Hmm.
ideas that I have in mind as well.
I was thinking of this really popular app that people use to host events now. It's called Partyful. It's like if you took Eventbrite, but it's more fun and more easy, I guess. And
Mhm.
I realized that this is actually one of the most pro-social apps I've ever used because it just makes organizing events extremely easy. So I think hosting, at least among my friends, probably like 3 times as many parties and hangouts as they used to. And they just do things like making it really easy to invite all the people from your previous event to come to a new event. And instead of email, it like sends like text blasts. And it's just a party hosting infrastructure. It counts up how many parties you've hosted. And these are all real life events. So I really like things like that just like get people together in real life more as well.
Oh, that's very good. I'm installing it now, and I'll let you know when it's my first party using it.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's great. I think I think that's a really useful insight that when people have a social infrastructure that they're embedded in that is in real life, that they're less likely to get addicted to internet things. But I'm also wondering, are there incentives for profit companies to optimize on these longer term metrics? Because like I think it would be great if companies were running surveys on how good do you feel after you've used this app for a day, but I'm not sure that they are because their business metrics point them in a more short-term direction.
Well, I mean, if it's subscription based, like Substack, then naturally it's more aligned than, the precision advertisement based models, simply because to retain your users for a long time, you will probably make them successful in some way that is everlasting. And so, in addition to Substack, I think LinkedIn also fits into that
Hmm.
pocket. Because again, the main funding model for LinkedIn is not targeted advertisement or addiction building, but rather what kind of career value you derive out of LinkedIn. And so even though it does have a news feed, it kind of penalizes the kind of overly addictive short-term attention seeking, like this here, comment to win a lottery or whatever thing that is rampant on other platforms.
Hmm. I hadn't thought about LinkedIn that way, but that makes a lot of sense. So I want to turn the conversation a little bit towards your work with the Taiwan Ministry of Digital Affairs, which you spent many years at. What
Mhm.
years were you there again?
So I joined the cabinet when I was 35. That was in 2016. I was the digital minister without portfolio, meaning there was no digital ministry at the time. It's more like a ad hoc team composed of people from all the different ministries, a little bit like the DOGE, I guess. And we call ourselves PDIS, the Public Digital Innovation Space. But in 2022, I was the inaugural minister. So altogether, I served 7.5 years, with the last 2 years serving with a full ministry.
One of the reasons I was very keen to have you on the podcast at this time is because, like you mentioned, there are some analogs between the stated intentions of something like DOGE and what you were doing in the Taiwanese cabinet, right? Trying to make government more effective, more efficient, incorporating technology where it makes sense. But these days, I would say that most Americans, especially progressive Americans, are very worried about the idea of taking a hacker's approach to politics because of the last few months of what DOGE has done. Like they have shut down USAID, they're firing tons of people indiscriminately, they're freezing funding for university research and causing chaos. I'm curious, like, as someone who has experience being sort of a inside hacker trying to make government more efficient, what are the DOGE folks getting wrong? What could they be doing instead, and what are they not?
Well, I mean, when I joined, already the US is having also the USDS, the US Digital Service, which is, by the way, the full name of DOGE today. They're officially the US DOGE Service, also the USDS, and the 18F. And so, in a sense, the idea is the same, to use technologies in the service of the transparency and accountability of government services. I remember when we first came in, we also look at all the procurement contracts, all the government spendings. We made bulletins, comparisons, so people can comment on it, and so on. So in that, I think that's not very different. One crucial difference is that we announced our every move. So one of the signature move I did when I first came in was to make sure that all the regulatory changes are open for public commentary for 60 days instead of just 7 and 14 days as previously the norm in Taiwan. And so that means that whenever we want to institutionalize something, for example, we want to respond to people's petition to reduce the text filing experience, especially on Mac and Linux, from 3 hours to 3 minutes. We do so not unannounced. We do so in the open, and people always have like 60 days to digest, to think through what kind of repercussions would this move be, and offer their commentary before we finally implement it 2 months afterwards. So I think that is a big difference, and it won much more trust from the career public service, who saw us as the public servant to serve the public service rather than kind of against the public service.
So you guys actually lengthened the period of feedback and comment. So it used to be much shorter and you made it longer in order to make things more efficient in the long run.
That's exactly right. Now, the idea is that we have much more experience at the time to see the conflicts or the various different comments, not as fire to be put out, but rather as energy sources that we can channel into co-creation and change. And so, literally, anyone who complained back in 2017 about the text filing system being, and I quote, explosively hostile, unquote, to Mac users are invited to the Ministry of Finance to draw the tax filing experience for the next year together. People already have a idea of how it could be better. It was just that people have very different ideas, And so offering a way for people to meet in a space collaboratively and design the experience together pre-bumps the polarization or the backlash and so on, and let us design in a way that take care of all the different needs.
So you are actually using that 60-day period itself as a way to collect different perspectives from around the government and synthesize them into a plan.
Exactly. In our national participation platform, join.gov.tw, which has been running for almost a decade now. Just recently, there's e-petitions that counts like hundreds of thousands of signatures. You see under each petition two columns. One is the supporting arguments and one is the contra arguments. Again, there's upvotes, there's downvotes, but there's no reply button. So people do not troll each other, but rather you can just see the ones floating to the top and take these as the foundation for bridge building. So the more people are energized by such conversations, actually the better signal we get on how to navigate this and find the uncommon ground.
Yeah, that feels like a really fundamental difference because Elon Musk Doge is very much like we know what's best, so we'll just start slashing and burning programs that we think are inefficient and bad. Whereas when you came in, you're starting from the assumption that people inside the administration already know that there are things that could be improved, and you just want to help leverage that expertise and make it actionable.
And also to give them air cover.
Mm.
The reformers within the system usually face this uphill battle of coordination problem. Like they know how this should be solved, but unless all the different levels of bosses line up, as well as people in other ministries line up, there really is no way to unilaterally force change. This is called a wicked problem. Most issues within bureaucracy are of this shape. And so through public consultation, the people who contribute as citizens are probably, I suspect, many of them section chiefs of the relevant departments. They just participate meronymically, for example, on PTT. And because we don't have this real name, real ID policy, I sincerely don't know who they are, but they do offer a very good context on how to navigate this. And so the 60 days kind of serve as a ideation period for all the different parts of this wicked problem to voice their actual difficulties. And so when we find the bridging systems consensus, we're actually also addressing the career public servants' woes and ideas, not just the people in the streets.
That's really interesting. So I just spent the last week in Washington, D.C., and right now in politics, another big conversation that's happening is about participation versus speed. And sometimes people create this binary of if we ask more people to participate, it's going to become less efficient. Sometimes it's DOGE, but even on the left, the abundance liberals, for example, who are advocating for more YIMBY policies, the solution to that is to close down channels of public participation that end up turning into vitocracies, right? Like community input meetings often get weaponized by wealthy landlords with a lot of time to block all new housing developments, and that's bad. And I agree that that's bad. But one thing that I've been struggling with is that I feel like we're just shutting down more opportunities for voice. And I guess I'm very interested in how do you create opportunities for participation that actually help things move more efficiently and move faster.
Yeah, definitely. For example, last March, we organized this online citizens assembly to solve the issue of fraudulent advertisements online. So at the time, if you open Facebook or YouTube, you very often see an ad posted by supposedly Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, a very successful Taiwanese, trying to sell you some stock or crypto. And if you click it, Jensen actually talks to you, except it's a deep fake. And so that is a big problem, not just because of the scam damage, but also because it crowds out the legitimate advertisements of small and medium enterprises. And so people do want it contained, but people don't want the state to have more censorial powers because Taiwan is the most free in all of Asia in terms of internet freedom, and people would like it to keep it this way. So previous attempts to assign more powers to the administration have failed. And so we sent 200,000 text messages to random numbers around Taiwan asking just, again, a very simple thing. What do you feel about this online fake ads, and what should we do together? And so people gave us their ideas. And also thousands signed up for the synchronous online assemblies. So we work with Stanford to choose randomly in a fair way, stratify random sampling. 450 people, that is statistically microcosm of Taiwanese population in terms of occupation, gender, age, place they live, and so on. And then they met in 45 rooms of 10 people each. And the room is itself a AI facilitator. So what we do is that when people are too quiet, the room encourage them to speak up. If people interrupt each other, the room makes sure it's just for 5 seconds and not longer, and so on. And so then in real time, we can see, for example, one room saying we should flip the default. Instead of assuming it's a real ad until somebody flags it, we should assume it's a scam unless Jensen Huang actually signs off on that advertisement. Another room says if it's scam ads and somebody gets scammed out of $5 million, we shouldn't fine Facebook. They'll just pay the fine. We should make them liable for the same damage, $5 million. And another room may say, if TikTok, ByteDance do not set up the legal compliance here, so we can't even assign them liability, well, we should slow down connection to TikTok until all their business goes to Google or something. And so all these are very proportionate, but the important thing is that we read them back at a plenary so that people, after another round of deliberation, they can vote how much they're comfortable with this kind of measure. And so these kind of measure at the end of the conversation, we already know and we can show to the legislator, regardless of their ideology, their party affiliation, and so on. More than 85% of Taiwanese population consider a KYC, know your customer, for advertisements is proportionate. And so in April, we checked with all the stakeholders, YouTube, Google AdSense team, and also the OpenAI, Microsoft, and the Meta, and so on. And they're like, yeah, of course, it's physically possible. It's just going to cost a lot. But that wasn't the question we were asking. And then by May, we already rolled out the legislation to the parliament, and it's very swiftly approved. One of the most fast-track bills, the Digital Signature Act. This year, if you open Facebook or YouTube, you don't see any fraudulent celebrity advertisements anymore. And so this kind of story is what we've have already proven, that it is actually faster if you ask everybody, what should we do together? If you can do this in a way that prioritize what we call conversation networks, which means the ideas that resonates within one group gets amplified to other groups, to the plenary, rather than just one single dunking voice polarizing this conversation, getting viral, and then making people like not able to enter into conversation. So broadcast networks serve its purpose for indignation, starting social movements, injustice, and so on. But we think conversation networks can actually weave a social fabric together in a very quick way, result in decisive action.
How did you build the political will inside the government to run processes like this? Because I can imagine a lot of people reacting with, that sounds like a great idea, but it's time consuming, requires all these resources to set up these rooms and whatever. How did you persuade people to do it?
I think the infrastructure view here is very important. If we do this in a per project basis without a shared platform, then every time you want to kickstart something, you have to prove that this is urgent enough to warrant this process. And also that it is not already within the mandate of some departments. Not many topics fit these two. But once we established some success that satisfy both the urgency and the interagency criteria 10 years ago, then we institutionalized that as a regulation. And so now the National Development Council provides this platform. So any city, any municipality, any ministry, and anyone in Taiwan can start such a conversation if they get 5,000 digital signatures online, right? So the point here is that when the bootstrapping threshold is low, people can bootstrap this kind of processes very easily by piggybacking on existing infrastructure. But if they have to get the software set up, the facilitator set up, everything by themselves, then it's almost impossible, except on the most urgent cases. And so in California, for example, we have been working with Governor Newsom's team, the GovOps and the ODI, the Data Innovation Office, for the past couple of years Engaged California, engaged.ca.gov to provide such a shared infrastructure. But the actual launch topic was on something that is urgent and interagency, which is how to recover from the LA fire. Now there's already more than 6,000 people going through this process. If people have a good experience, the next time starting a conversation around other issues that are not as urgent will still be felt as proportionate because you can refer back to the positive or even peak experience that happened before.
So like building like reusable infrastructure so that just like posting a tweet is very easy because there's already this entire infrastructure for posting tweets. You were just making the kind of political behavior that you were excited about much easier and simpler.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
And that also is norm shaping in a sense that then when people have a good idea and they want to get people to support their idea, they can kind of rely on this platform to find the unlikely allies across generational, urban, rural, or even partisan.
I also really like the element of taking a little bit longer to collect perspectives so that actually getting legislation through becomes more efficient. It kind of reminds me of being a product manager and you always have the meetings before the meeting, right? Like you have to like go around and talk to all of the individual stakeholders and hear everybody out and do a brainstorming session because then by the time that you actually introduce, okay, here's the plan, everyone's already mostly bought into it or at least understands why it's happening and you don't have like a fiery crazy debate afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So this is again very common sense in product development. It's just applied to the civic and political processes.
How do you think that you became such a good facilitator? Because when I talk to you, it sounds like you have a very keen sense of these social dynamics and how to bridge very different groups. How do you think you developed that skill?
So when I was born, I practiced a lot of the Taoism practices of Qigong, the inner breathing exercises, and many others. And the reason why is that it's a survival skill. I was born with a heart defect, so until I was 12, I wasn't sure I would survive to the day of surgery. I got a heart surgery when I was 12, and actually the doctors, when I was 4, told me and my family that this child only has a 50% chance to survive to such a day. So not only I go to sleep feeling like flipping a coin, if it doesn't come up correctly, I may not wake up, but also I literally cannot be upset if I have a higher than a certain threshold beats per minute in my heart. I just faint and maybe wake up in hospital or something. And so I think that is one large part of this work. It is to essentially always switch to system to the slow mode of thinking whenever a conflict arises and just take time to understand more fully the context, the position where people other than me are coming from. And if I feel I really cannot comprehend what they're doing, I don't suffer from this upsetness of a racing heartbeat, fight or flight or flee or whatever, but rather I always engage them with a sense of curiosity and maybe spend time with them until I can actually see the world their way. So in my mind, there's no people who are like me and people who are different from me. There's only like people I can share some experience with and people I have not yet shared some experience with.
And you're saying that that comes from certain Taoist practices as well?
Yes. So if you think of the Taoism symbol, like the Tai Chi, it's two very polarized sides, getting into a circle, complementing each other, and also finding each other embedded within, kind of recursively. So that symbolism to me means that instead of saying, okay, these people are my people, those people are not my people, I see some of the shared common grounds possible within any confrontation. And I'm genuinely curious and want to basically spend many hours or even days, if necessary, to find out what actually is that perspective that can maybe not let the left and right eye see eye to eye, but at least see in a kind of stereoscopic vision.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the thing I'm reflecting on is that you also mentioned that your parents are journalists. And for me, I don't have that spiritual tradition. I didn't grow up with that kind of heart condition. But one thing that I've noticed since I became a full-time journalist is that that practice has actually helped me become less angry also at things that I find in the world because I switch from I'm mad at this thing mode to journalism mode and just start asking questions and collecting information. And as a journalist, if I say, okay, you find this thing really crazy and weird, uh, but can you actually just sit down for 45 minutes with 10 people who think this way and ask them lots of questions? And as a journalist, you can't be in convincing mode. You're just doing your job poorly if you're doing that. So I actually have to, okay, let me sit down and really hear people out and hear their motivations and just take notes the entire time. I found that this has been both really educational and a great coping mechanism because I do come out the other side in almost every case understanding people better and differently. And I think this is one of the things that makes me most happy about doing writing now is I think it makes me a more empathetic person. And I hope it's good for my approach to politics and social change as well.
Yeah, I can really see you smiling. So it's a real pursuit of happiness. And and I do think that that is genuinely what interpersonal joy came from. It is from like breaking through a perceived gap or perceived alien relationship, and then just making sure that after working through it, we see the world differently. And it's both sides actually, not just the facilitator or the journalist side, but the people who were facilitated or who have seen the journalistic outputs of their side and other people's side, their life also changes this way.
I know you spent some time when you were younger doing a lot of education activism, and I'm sort of curious, like, with these principles in mind, if these are the kinds of citizens that we want to develop, how do you think of reforming education to make that more possible?
I think what we want is not just literacy, which is passively consuming information, but rather competence, which is the ability to produce in a social context information. And in Taiwan in 2019, we switched our curriculum to do just that. So what used to be media literacy, data literacy, and so on are now media competence, data competence classes. And so instead of just teaching critical thinking about, for example, air pollution, water pollution, noise level, and so on. The students actually measure these together and using distributed ledger technology, they write this in a way that cannot be tampered with and contributes to the common understanding of the environment. Or they fact check the three presidential candidates in real time as they're having a debate and contribute to the common understanding of what actually is going on in the campaigns. Or they do e-petitions and change the rules such that they don't have to go to school that early. They go to school now 1 hour later because they proved together that 1 more hour of sleep is actually better than 1 more hour of study when it comes to their grades. And so I think the effectiveness of making change is what we can get the learners to switch from a consuming mode to a co-production mode. It's like the Pygmalion effect. If you treat 15-year-olds as already adults and imbue in them the ability to set the national agenda for conversations and so on, and even retaining some of them as cabinet level senior advisors, what we call reverse mentors to the ministers even before they turn 18, then they feel that they're already adults and actually have a lot of very good things to contribute. In 2022, the International Civics and Citizenship Study, ICCS, ranked the Taiwanese 15 years old as top of the world when it comes to their civic competence and their ability to participate in shaping national conversations on people on the planet and things like that. And I think that has a lot to do with this new curriculum's emphasis on active competence, not just literacy.
I really like that switching from consumer mode to production mode. Even taking something like TikTok that like we are talking about it as addictive, but I actually think that if more people were making TikToks, I would feel much less bad because it's actually a very creative, oftentimes also a collaborative thing to try to think like, okay, let me think of a funny sketch or a thing I want to share with my friends or edit a video along with some music in an aesthetic way. And the thing that I often hope for is how do we get more people producing? Whether that means something as big as startup or whether that means something as small as I'm going to get with some friends and make a sketch comedy video or do a petition at my school. I think for me, some of my earliest like formative experiences were basically like I did a petition at my middle school and it accidentally kind of worked. And that was like a crazy experience of learning very early that you can have a dent on the world and not just be a passive person who the world washes over. Um, yeah, so I think about that a lot. And that's one of the things that I find very inspiring about Taiwan and my experiences being there is it seems like there's a very rich culture of whether it's youth activism, whether it's small businesses and people opening those. Yeah, I just like wonder like how can we get more of this producer culture to happen?
Or even just throwing a party, right? Using a new app. Yeah, one of my earliest experience voting was when I turned 20. I voted for the first time in the neighborhood leader election in Muzha, south of Taipei City. And then the candidate that I supported won by one vote. And that's very
Wow.
yeah, because otherwise it would be down to a coin flip. So I felt that, oh, all the time I spent reading up their campaign promises and traveling from the center of Taipei back to Muzha is very much worthwhile. And so I do think these earlier wins are very important, which is why we should not limit this to just once every 4 years or 2 years. We need to make sure that there's many ways for young people to express their ideas and not just opposing, but proposing and having some of that proposal work and work in a very well understood fashion so that people can really look up to the young people that has shaped even national conversations.
Yeah, this is the sort of like everyday democracy stuff I'm thinking a lot about. Like, there's a cultural practice of contributing to the world around you versus a every 4 years you show up at the ballot box, you color in some circles, and then you literally forget about it for another 4 years until it comes back again. Um, I'm trying to think about how in the US to make this happen.
We're seeing more and more places take up the engaged California method of digital democracy. And I think language models have a lot to contribute here because previously, once we have like tens of thousands of contributions, even we know which ones are bridge building, it's still a lot of time spent to read through all of them. But now, using language models, we can do what's called sense making, which is to show very clearly, like a data journalist, what are the overarching themes, and of course, always grounded to the individual statements as footnotes, and also what are the outstanding divisions so that people can reflect on that further. And this kind of continuous like group selfie was not possible before the advent of language models. And I think this deployment makes me really optimistic about the everyday democracy use cases because previously it required a lot of investment in terms of staff. But now, even when the smallest neighborhoods, intentional communities, and so on can run those sense making tools automatically, it's now built in to the Polis tool, the open source tool that we used in 2015.
Or it's like when people are using like the texting polling and they say, here's my one sentence, and now you have 100,000 comments in natural language, you can actually figure out what people are thinking.
Yes, and then when we took action, it also allowed us to close the loop to tell exactly these people because you said this and you said this. Now we're doing this action together. So the feeling of satisfaction is much stronger because then we can individually go back to people and encourage the constructive behavior. They may have also submitted a lot of very kind of destructive comments, but as long as you reward only the one part that is constructive that led to decisive action, people really do change. This is what I call troll hugging. This is one of my
Oh,
techniques. Yeah.
that's amazing. Yeah, that actually, it reminds me of being a product manager again too, because Substack writers sometimes they're very angry at us and they send me an email and it has like, here are 10 reasons I think your product is buggy and not good enough and reasons it sucks. And then a month later, maybe you've only done 2 of the things on the list and there's still 8 that you haven't done yet, but you go back and you somehow remember that email and email that person again. It's like, hey, because you said this a month ago, we have now fixed these 2 issues. We're going to still work on the others, but wanted to let you know. I do actually find that people are usually really pleasantly surprised because I think a lot of people don't even have an expectation that a company or a government will ever speak back to them. People don't expect to be heard by the institution. And then as soon as it does respond, when there are these small moments of responsiveness, it really changes the emotional dynamic.
And we're happy to see it's not just in California. Like as we speak in Kentucky, in Bowling Green, there is what could Bowling Green be? Police conversation going on. So as more people become aware of these tools for broad listening, I think broadcasting would not be the only norm when it comes to the politicians' interactions with the population. Instead of just one person speaking to millions and ignoring the millions' voices, it's now equally easy to listen to millions of people and have millions of people form conversation networks. It was just not a norm, but we're seeing more and more successful experiments now.
Now I'm imagining like a YouTube or a Twitch live react where like a politician is screen sharing and they have like a polis type surfaces different ideas and questions from the community and the politician is like live reacting on a Twitch stream and
Yeah,
answering people's
that's
questions.
literally what was done in Tokyo.
Oh,
So there
great.
is a governor candidate, Takahiro Ano. He's 33 years old and read the book Plurality that I co-wrote and decided to run for governor of Tokyo 1 month before the voting day, and practically nobody have heard of him. And he just synthesized his avatar as a VTuber and did exactly that sort of live streaming that you talk about and use the broad listening tools, Polis and talk to the city and so on, so that anyone can just hashtag Tokyo AI to form the platform together and even call into a dedicated line and talk to his voice clone about his platform. And so the platform crowdsourced this way was actually independently ranked as the best score, even better than Koike-san, the existing governor who, of course, won the re-election. But Koike-san now appoints Ano-san as the advisor to GovTech Tokyo so that you can also hashtag talk to Koike and have this real-time sense making.
That's awesome. I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing. The example that I have in mind, which is not quite as high tech, but I really like how AOC in the US, she uses her Instagram stories very effectively. And she'll just run the Instagram survey tool. I remember right after the election in November, she said something like, if you voted for me and Donald Trump, why did you do that? And she then posted on her story like 40 different responses, a giant collage of what people who followed her on Instagram said without, judging, just like displaying what the responses were. And then she, I think, collected them and did a little Instagram live or a little story video speaking to those people saying like, I hear you, I understand, this is what I think. And I just thought that was such a good use of technology. And, a lot of our representatives are not quite as savvy, but I would really like to see more of that kind of behavior. It's sort of the evolution of the town hall, because now town halls just get captured by old people. But what is the evolution that can bring more people into it?
Also, I think the emerging conversation network technologies, such as Cortico from MIT or Remesh, basically allows people with no particular training to interact with a large crowd as if it's just a few avatars you're interacting with, or you listen to a medley of different fragments of people's voices so that you get a holistic understanding, and then you just respond normally as you would to a few people. I think that will also massively lower the threshold for politicians to meaningfully engage because they do not need to basically operate like 10 different windows together and see through like 500 different comments and so on, but rather just respond as if it's a common voice that is woven through the medleys thanks to language models.
I'll check out those tools that you mentioned and I'll make sure to link them in the transcript. I feel like you're very good at doing this yourself, like engaging with people on different social media apps, doing podcasts like this one. I read the transcript that you recently appeared on the Laura Loomer show. For people who don't know, she's a popular MAGA personality, a big supporter of Donald Trump. I imagine that you and Laura, on some areas, have very different politics. But I thought it was really interesting and cool that you did that. I think very few Democratic politicians in the US would ever consider doing so. And your approach was very clever because you started by saying, I want to talk about freedom of speech and resisting authoritarian censorship. I'm just curious to hear more. How did you decide to go on her show? How did you meet her? How did it go?
Yeah, so I decided to be on her show through a common friend, Glenn Weil, who helped Laura to get a Blue Sky account when she was having some difficulties with X.com, and she was swiftly banned on Blue Sky without even posting a thing. And also, we helped to restore that account. And so, one of the main things that attracts me is that the live stream viewers, 60,000 of them, on X.com and also on Rumble, registered True Social account just for this, was actually extremely supportive of our mission of countering authoritarianism in a way that does not become more authoritarian ourselves. I think that really is a ethos that we here in Taiwan took to heart because we cannot afford to go back to the martial law. If we go back to the martial law, the authoritarian has already won and taken over. So we have to counter those threats without resorting to authoritarian means. And that means to double down on freedom of speech and figuring out how to make more speech, more context building, and also healing of communities. And in a sense, that is also what they want. So I find paradoxically like a lot of validation and a lot of supportive statements from the real-time live streaming comment box, and I insisted on like reading them out, and Laura projected it, and all in all, I think it's a very good experience.
This is one of the things I broadly have noticed about the way that you approach politics. Like you always find the uncommon ground. In this case, it's freedom of speech, resisting authoritarianism. Another thing I've noticed is that you are very good with finding creative framings and being flexible with language because people react very emotionally to language, right? Like you use the right word, use the wrong word. The underlying thing can be the same, and people have very different kind of emotional reactions. But you're very comfortable switching between saying digital public goods and security infrastructure and freedom of speech technologies, depending on your audience. But really, you're referring to the same thing. And even in the way you always tell people, you my pronouns are whatever, call me whatever you
Yeah,
want. I'm the same
literally
person.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just think
Uh,
that's such an awesome approach to political messaging.
mhm. I do truly believe that people want the same thing, right?
Hmm.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Who would be against that, right? Just as in the Taiwan's case of the Civic Assembly against online fraud, there's no pro-fraud faction in the political system. There's no constituency that says we want more fraud. In California, there's no constituency that said we want more damage from wildfire. That's literally unthinkable, right? So what we need to do as politicians and as diplomats is to cherish these uncommon ground and make them more common. I think that will very effectively move past the perceived polarization because the actual polarization isn't actually that much.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. We often have the opposite in the US where like you change the name of a building to be less offensive, but actually you still have like exclusionary housing rules and like, okay, now the racist guy's name is off the building, but like people of different races cannot live together. So it's kind of the opposite.
In a sense, that is the difference between communities take actions together rather than just take a representation of the symbolic representation of the action. And I think it's very easy in the digital age to confuse the two, and only communities banded together can reliably move past just the symbolic phase and into actual actions.
Overall, it sounds like you've had a lot of accomplishments and successes navigating these very wicked, thorny political problems. I'm curious what you have found most challenging in your political roles. Like, what is unexpectedly difficult?
Mhm. One of the most challenging thing we overcame together as a minister was COVID-19. Nobody expected it. And indeed, in early 2020, we faced the twin threats of not just the pandemic, but also the infodemic, a lot of very strongly charged, polarized opinions that are not quite right or wrong because the science is not very determined yet. For example, on mask use. In Taiwan, we've had one faction saying because of the SARS experience, only N95, the highest grade, is useful. But another faction saying, any mask is hurt the people because the ventilation is important and N95 hurts the most. So without some way to find uncommon grounds, people will just drift apart even without algorithmic polarization. But as I mentioned, in every ministry, there's a team of participation officers. It just so happens that our health ministry's participation officer lives with this very cute dog, a Shiba Inu, the DOGE dog. And so we pushed out this meme of the Shiba Inu, the dog, putting her paw to her mouth, saying, wear a mask to remind each other to keep your unwashed hand from your face. Now, this is truly an uncommon ground, like mask just as a hand washing indicator. Nobody can say that I'm against hand washing. There's no such faction. And masks do protect the mouth from your own hands. So because it's such a good uncommon ground, we actually measure tap water usage, and it just increased a lot once this meme pushes out. People who have laughed about this meme in a kind of humor over rumor way could not get as agitated again by the polarized narrative around mask use. So we did that around masks, around vaccines, so that we depolarize the society, even at a very height of polarization.
So the government needs to get better at making memes, is what I'm taking away.
Exactly. Mimetic engineering is essential.
Are there any ways that you have evolved your views on how to accomplish social change over the last 10-ish years, something that you didn't quite understand at first and only came to later?
So, as a outsider, I thought that the private sector and the social sector is innovative, and the bureaucracy is just maintaining the status quo. But that was not the case. I've learned that the public servants are actually the most innovative, especially around wicked problems. All they need is a air cover. For example, the presidential hackathon, where they can participate, and we basically said each team need at least one civil society, one private sector, one public sector, so they have plausible deniability. If their idea doesn't work, they can say, oh, we're just attending an event, it's a civil society's idea. But if it does work, and every year there's 5 teams that receive the trophy, so basically promising whatever small-scale experiment you just did will get promoted to national infrastructure level on the next fiscal year. And so then your entire career changes. So providing air cover for the rooms to make mistakes and also share the credits when they actually made something work. That I think is much more useful and much more innovative as an innovation system compared to just you letting one or two champions or fellows or people who kind of airdrop from the private sector or the social sector into the career bureaucracy. Some of that intermixing does help, but I think the systemic change need to be done from within.
That's super interesting because I also would have assumed similar. There's a bad stereotype of bureaucrats as just like not having any new ideas, when in fact it sounds like you were saying that they have the ideas, they just need air cover for them.
Hmm.
And that those are the opportunities that you can create.
Exactly.
One thing that really strikes me throughout this conversation is that you are like relentlessly optimistic. You don't get angry. There's always a solution or a way out of the most difficult problems. But I feel like you have to humanize yourself a bit for us mortals who get annoyed at things. When was the last time you got annoyed at anything, even just like a tiny bit?
Well, I tried this microphone, the HyperX podcast, and then the podcast host tells me that I have a metallic, almost cyborg-like voice. I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll have to replace this microphone after all. So I felt slightly annoyed for maybe half a second. Maybe you didn't see that.
No, I didn't. You were perfect at covering it up.
Well, 720 p. This isn't very good at transmitting micro expressions.
I if that's the angriest that you ever really get, then we should all learn something from that. The last question that I ask all my guests is, what's a research rabbit hole that you are going down these days? I'd love to hear if there's anything that you're exploring that's more speculative or you're still learning about.
Recently, I've been surveying various different ways to piece together those conversation network technologies. So think about not just one POTUS conversation or one engaged California conversation. Think about if each participant can kind of take home a snapshot of what was just agreed there and disagreed there and start their own neighborhood conversations using a different sort of technology. But assuming there's something like RSS that can bridge between all those different tools, I think that would be very cool. Some people, like the MetaGov project, is now funding the interoperability projects to at least get all those different projects import and export in an open format. But how to weave those formats together in a reliable way that does not require a kind of top-down controlled schema of taxonomy. Well, maybe again, this is something language models can truly help. And that is one of my really forward-looking research interest is just to look at the existing communication and conversation network and facilitation practices and figure out assistive intelligence, AIs that can serve as kind of eyeglasses to facilitators, so that facilitators do not to change their practices, but can kind of automatically facilitate deeper conversations with more people across more scale. And that's the subject of a recent paper on Archive, Conversation Network, that I co-wrote with Larry Lessig and Deb Roy. And I encourage you to check it out and let me know any ideas that you may have on this regard.
Oh, awesome. I'll read that paper afterwards. So, where can people follow all of your work? What's the best place?
I'm on Blue Sky, audreyt.org, also on Fediverse, on g0v.social. My handle is at AU. I'm still on x.com. Let me just post this tweet. Democracy isn't something you have, it's something you practice daily. Jasmine beautifully captures Taiwan's civic heartbeat and why active participation matters now more than ever. I think that's a truly beautiful civic muscle post that you wrote up. And feel free to follow me there as at Audrey Tang. I'm also on Truth Social.
A plurality of networks. Very impressive. Thank you so much. This was so fun, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to come on this podcast. And for anyone listening, also, you can find all the links and the full transcript and all these papers that Audrey's referencing at jasmine.substack.com. I'll put everything there. Thank you so much. This was fun.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.